The fire began when the sky over Cork was still dark. The flames rose so quickly that neighbors swore they heard something between the crackling, as if an ancient melody was trying to survive amidst the chaos. In the center of the house, a silver-haired lady refused to leave, clinging to a burning piano as though she were defending the last piece of something sacred. When the firefighters reached her, she whispered a name, and that name made one of them freeze instantly. No one on that street could have imagined that the fire wasn't just destroying a house. It was igniting a secret that had been buried for over 40 years. The kind of secret that, when it surfaces, changes everything you believe about love, guilt, and forgiveness. But the most terrifying part was still to come. Because the music that survived the fire didn't belong to who everyone thought it did. The fire started at 17 minutes past 4 in the morning, an anomalous glare in the windows of a small house in Cove, along the harbor's edge. When the firefighters arrived, the smell of burnt wood and sea salt mixed with the sound of wind cutting through the flaming roof. In the center of the room, Eileen O'Driscoll, 78 years old, sat on the floor covered in soot, clutching what remained of a black piano. The instrument looked dead, but she, with her eyes open and fixed, murmured something inaudible, as if she could still hear music that no one else could. Whilst the team tried to pull her away, one of the firefighters, Ronan Kelleher, a young man in his early 30s, heard Eileen whisper a name that paralyzed him. Aoife. It was his mother's name. The same name of the woman who, decades earlier, had composed the song that became a hymn in Catholic schools across Ireland. For an instant, time seemed to fold, and Ronan stood there motionless, staring at the old woman covered in ash like someone witnessing a secret he didn't yet understand. The air was thick with smoke and something else, something heavier, like grief suspended in the atmosphere. Ronan's hands trembled as he knelt beside her. Eileen's dress was singed at the edges, her wrinkled hands blackened, but her grip on the piano remained firm. It was as though she believed that letting go would mean losing something far more precious than her life. "Let it go, Mrs." Ronan said softly, his Cork accent thick with urgency. "You'll burn alive if you stay here." But Eileen didn't respond. Her lips moved, forming words that dissolved into the crackling heat. Her eyes, though clouded with age, held a clarity that unsettled him, as if she were looking not at the flames, but through them, into a past only she could see. When Eileen finally fainted in his arms, a piece of charred paper slipped from inside the piano and landed on the floor. A fragment of sheet music, with an old signature. And whilst the fire was brought under control, Ronan felt an inexplicable shiver. He had no idea, but that piece of music, and that woman, would completely change the course of his life. Outside, the harbor wind swept through the narrow streets of Cove, carrying with it the scent of the sea and the faint echo of sirens. The neighbors stood in clusters wrapped in blankets and shock, whispering amongst themselves. Some made the sign of the cross. Others simply stared at the smoking ruin, their faces pale in the pre-dawn light. Ronan carried Eileen to the ambulance, her frail body surprisingly light in his arms. As the paramedics took over, he glanced back at the house. The flames had been subdued, but smoke still poured from the broken windows like ghosts escaping. Something about the scene felt wrong, not just tragic but deliberate, as though the fire had been waiting for this moment. He returned to the wreckage, careful not to disturb the investigation his colleagues were beginning. The piano sat in the center of the room, its surface charred beyond recognition, keys melted into grotesque shapes. But beneath the destruction, something caught his eye. Ronan crouched low, brushing aside debris with gloved hands. There, wedged beneath the carbonized keys, was an envelope. Old, yellowed, and remarkably intact despite the inferno that had raged around it. His heart pounded as he pulled it free. The handwriting on the front was elegant, though faded by time. It read, E. O'Driscoll, 1981. He turned the envelope over in his hands, feeling its weight, the texture of paper that had survived decades. A strange dread settled over him, the kind that comes when you're about to uncover something you're not ready to know. Kelleher, one of his colleagues shouted from outside. We need you out here. Ronan slipped the envelope into his jacket pocket, his pulse quickening. He stood slowly, casting one last look at the ruined piano, at the shattered remains of a life he knew nothing about. The name Awaf echoed in his mind, mingling with the crackle of dying embers. As he stepped out into the cold morning air, the sky above Cove began to lighten, streaks of pale orange breaking through the darkness. But Ronan felt no relief. Only the creeping certainty that the fire had revealed something far more dangerous than it had destroyed. And somewhere, in the silence between the wind and the waves, he could have sworn he heard it. A melody, faint and sorrowful, drifting across the harbor like a ghost refusing to rest. The following day, in the storage room of the fire station, Ronan stared at the partially destroyed piano as though looking at a rescued body. When he shifted one of the charred boards, the envelope fell open, revealing yellowed pages with handwritten notes and a title, Hymn for the Morning Sea. The handwriting was delicate, and in the bottom corner, the same name he'd heard from the woman amidst the flames, E. O'Driscoll. The sensation of holding something forbidden or long forgotten made him shudder. He stood alone in the dimly lit room, the smell of smoke still clinging to the instrument. Outside, the sounds of the station continued, voices, footsteps, the distant wail of sirens. But here, in this quiet corner, time seemed suspended. Ronan's fingers traced the edges of the paper, careful not to damage it further. The ink had faded in places, but the notes were clear enough. Beautiful, even. But it was what lay beside the score that truly unsettled him. A cassette tape, small and ancient, with a label barely legible. Choir 1981. Ronan turned it over in his hands, his pulse quickening. He hadn't seen one of these in years. His father used to have boxes of them in the attic, relics of a time before everything became digital and disposable. Curiosity gnawed at him. He slipped the tape into his pocket and glanced around the storage room, as though someone might catch him in the act of stealing. But stealing what? A burnt piano and a cassette that probably didn't even work anymore? That evening, Ronan drove to his father's house on the outskirts of Cork. The old man was out, likely at the pub, which suited Ronan fine. He didn't want to explain what he was looking for. He made his way to the attic, a cramped space filled with forgotten things. Boxes of photographs, broken furniture, and, buried beneath a moth-eaten blanket, an old cassette player. Ronan brought it downstairs, dusted it off, and plugged it in. His hands trembled slightly as he inserted the tape and pressed play. For a moment there was only the hiss of static, and he thought it might be blank. But then a voice emerged, soft, warm, and achingly familiar. "Good morning, girls." Let's start with the chorus. Remember, feel the sea. Ronan's breath caught. It was Eileen, much younger but unmistakably her. The voice carried a quiet authority, the kind that comes from years of teaching, of shaping young minds. And then, the melody began. He knew it immediately. The same song his mother used to sing at Mass, at school events, at family gatherings. The song she claimed to have composed alone. The song that had made her a beloved figure in the county. Hymn for the Morning Sea. But this wasn't his mother's voice. This was Eileen's choir, Eileen's direction, Eileen's creation. Ronan paused the tape, his heart pounding. He rewound it and played it again, listening more carefully this time. The girls' voices were clear and bright, singing in harmony, their accents distinctly Cork. And behind them, barely audible, the sound of a piano, the same piano that now sat in ruins at the fire station. He stopped the tape and sat in silence, the weight of what he'd just heard pressing down on him. This couldn't be a coincidence. Perhaps Eileen had been an old colleague of his mother's, or something more. Ronan looked again at the name on the envelope and felt a strange heaviness in his chest. If that song truly belonged to her, what had made her live isolated and forgotten, whilst his mother was celebrated as the great composer of the county? The next morning, Ronan went to the hospital. He needed answers, and Eileen was the only one who could give them. The corridors smelt of disinfectant and boiled vegetables, the fluorescent lights harsh against the pale green walls. He asked for her room number at the front desk, but the nurse, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes, frowned when she heard the name. Eileen O'Driscoll? She's in room 12, but... The nurse hesitated, glancing at her notes. She's left specific instructions. No visitors with the surname Kelleher. Ronan felt as though the floor had dropped beneath him. What? I'm sorry, the nurse said, her tone softening. Those were her exact words. She was very clear about it. He stood there, stunned, his mind racing. She knew. Of course she knew. She'd whispered his mother's name in the middle of the fire. She'd known exactly who he was the moment he carried her out of that house. Can you at least tell her I was here? Ronan asked, his voice barely steady. Tell her. Tell her I found the tape. The nurse nodded slowly, though her expression suggested she didn't understand. Ronan turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing down the empty corridor. Outside, the sky over Cork was gray and heavy with rain. He sat in his car for a long time, staring at nothing, the cassette tape still in his jacket pocket. The truth was there, so close he could almost touch it, but it was guarded by a woman who wanted nothing to do with him, or with his family. And that, more than anything, told him he was right. Something terrible had happened between Eileen O'Driscoll and Eoif Kelleher. Something that had cost one woman everything, and given the other a legacy built on silence. Ronan started the engine and drove home through the rain, the melody of Hymn for the Morning Sea playing over and over in his mind. But now it didn't sound like a hymn. It sounded like a lament. Ronan returned home disturbed. Eileen's refusal seemed to confirm that there was something deeper and older between her and his family. That night, he rummaged through old boxes of photographs and clippings that his mother kept. In one of the folders, he found an image from 1982, a class of students from a Catholic school in Ballincollig, surrounding two women. One of them, smiling and confident, was Off Kelleher, young and elegant. The other, discreet with a weary gaze, was Eileen O'Driscoll. On the back of the photo there was a handwritten dedication, "To my colleague Eileen, whose music touches the heavens." Ronan stared at the photograph for a long time, trying to reconcile the faces in the picture with the lives they'd lived since. His mother looked radiant, her blonde hair perfectly styled, her posture that of someone who knew exactly where she belonged in the world. Eileen, by contrast, seemed almost apologetic in her stance, shoulders slightly hunched, her smile tentative. But it was what lay beneath the dedication that made his blood run cold. Using the torch on his mobile, Ronan angled the photograph under the light. There, scratched beneath the ink, almost erased, he could just make out the words, "Forgive me, if you can." The chill ran down his spine. Suddenly, the admiration he'd always felt for his mother gained a bitter taste. He wondered, what if her success had been born from theft? He set the photograph down and leaned back against the wall of his childhood bedroom, surrounded by the ghosts of a past he thought he'd understood. The room was exactly as he'd left it when he moved out at 18. Posters of hurling matches, a stack of old vinyl records, a crucifix above the bed. But now it all felt foreign, like a set piece from someone else's life. His mother had always been respected in Cork. People stopped her on the street to thank her for her music, for the way Hymn for the Morning Sea had accompanied their children through school, through weddings, through funerals. It was woven into the fabric of the community. And now, Ronan was beginning to suspect it had been stolen from the woman who should have been celebrated instead. The following day, he returned to the hospital, determined to insist. He didn't care what instructions Eileen had left. He needed to hear the truth from her own lips. The nurse at the desk recognized him and shook her head. "Mr. Kelleher, I told you. I know what you told me," Ronan interrupted, his voice firm but not unkind. "But I need to see her. Please, just 5 minutes." The nurse sighed, glancing down the corridor as though expecting someone to intervene. Finally, she relented. "Room 12. But if she asks you to leave, you leave. Understood?" "Understood." Eileen was sitting by the window when he entered, her gaze fixed on the gray sky beyond the glass. Her face was marked by small burns and wrinkles that seemed to contain entire stories. When she saw him, she looked away. "You shouldn't have come," she said, her voice weak. Ronan's hands trembled as he pulled the sheet music from his jacket and placed it on the table beside her bed. "This song, it's yours, isn't it?" She remained silent for what felt like an eternity. The only sound was the faint beeping of a monitor somewhere down the hall and the distant murmur of voices. Then, quietly, almost as though speaking to herself, Eileen murmured, "Not just mine. It was the only thing I had left of my husband, and she took it from me." Ronan felt the air leave his lungs. "Your husband?" Eileen's eyes glistened, but no tears fell. She looked older than her 78 years in that moment, as though the weight of the past had finally caught up with her. He wrote the melody the week before he died, a fishing accident off the coast. They found his body 3 days later, washed up near the old head of Kinsale. Her voice cracked and she paused, swallowing hard. "I was carrying our child. She was stillborn 2 months after I lost him. The song was all I had left. I played it for the girls at school, thinking it might bring me some peace. And our wife? She said it was beautiful. She said everyone should hear it." Ronan's chest tightened. "But she put her name on it." "She did," Eileen whispered. "And when I confronted her, she told me it was for my own good. That if people knew the truth, that I was an unwed mother, that my husband had died without us ever marrying in the eyes of the church, I'd be ruined. They'd have dismissed me, called me a disgrace." The bitterness in her voice was unmistakable now, though it was tempered by something else. Exhaustion, perhaps, or the kind of resignation that comes from decades of carrying a secret too heavy to share. "So she took it," Ronan said, his voice hollow. "And you let her." "I didn't have a choice," Eileen replied, finally meeting his gaze. "Not then. Not in that Ireland." The silence that followed was suffocating. Ronan wanted to say something, to offer comfort or apology, but the words wouldn't come. What could he possibly say that would undo 40 years of injustice? Eileen turned back to the window, her expression unreadable. "And if you're her son, then perhaps fate has come to collect what the fire let slip." For days, Ronan lived divided between loyalty and guilt. He wanted to believe in his mother, but the fear that she had truly taken something from Eileen gnawed at him. He searched for school records, old newspapers, any mention of the song Hymn for the Morning Sea. He discovered a report from 1983. Teacher Ioife Kelleher moves Cork with original hymn. The text mentioned, inspiration from an anonymous colleague. No name, no credit. Ronan sat in the local library, surrounded by microfilm readers and dusty archives, his eyes strained from hours of searching. The article was brief, barely half a column, but it was enough. There was a photograph, too. His mother at the piano, her hands poised over the keys, her expression serene and humble. The caption read, Mrs. Kelleher credits her deep faith and love of the sea for the hymn's haunting beauty. He felt sick. There was no mention of Eileen, no acknowledgement of collaboration, no tribute to a colleague. Just his mother, bathed in the warm glow of local admiration, accepting praise for something that wasn't entirely hers. He folded the printout and slipped it into his jacket, his jaw tight. The library was nearly empty, just an elderly man dozing near the radiator and a young student scribbling notes at a corner table. Ronan walked out into the gray Cork afternoon, the weight of what he'd learned pressing down on him like wet wool. That evening, he drove to his mother's house. It was a modest cottage on the edge of town, with a slate roof and a small garden that she tended obsessively. The windows glowed warmly in the fading light, and he could see her silhouette moving about inside, probably preparing supper. He let himself in with the key she'd given him years ago. "Ma'am?" "In the kitchen, love," she called back, her voice light and familiar. Ronan found her at the stove stirring a pot of stew. She turned and smiled at him, wiping her hands on her apron. "I wasn't expecting you. Have you eaten?" "I'm not hungry." He set his jacket on the back of a chair and looked at her, really looked at her. The lines around her eyes, the gray creeping into her hair, the way she held herself with quiet dignity. She'd always been so strong, so certain. And now, standing in her kitchen, he wasn't sure he knew her at all. "What's wrong?" she asked, her smile fading. "You look upset." "I need to ask you something," Ronan said, his voice steady despite the storm inside him. "And I need you to tell me the truth." Oif set down the wooden spoon, her expression guarded. "All right. Did you write Hymn for the Morning Sea?" The silence that followed was deafening. His mother's face paled, and for a moment she looked as though she might collapse. She gripped the edge of the counter, her knuckles white. "Where is this coming from?" she asked quietly. "Just answer the question." Eoif closed her eyes, and when she opened them again, they were filled with something Ronan had never seen before. Shame. No, she whispered. Not all of it. He felt as though he'd been struck. Even though he'd suspected, hearing her admit it made it real in a way it hadn't been before. So you stole it. It wasn't like that. Then what was it like? Ronan's voice rose, and he hated how it cracked, how the anger mixed with hurt. You took someone's work and put your name on it. That's theft, ma'am. That's... I was trying to protect her, a wife shouted, and the force of it silenced him. She took a shaky breath, her hands trembling. I was trying to protect Eileen. From what? From them, she said, her voice breaking. From the school, from the parish, from everyone who would have crucified her if they'd known the truth. Ronan stared at her, his heart pounding. What truth? Oifa sank into a chair, her face in her hands. When she spoke again, her voice was barely audible. Eileen was pregnant, unmarried. Her partner had died at sea, and she was carrying his child. If the school had found out, they'd have sacked her on the spot. She'd have been shamed, cast out, she'd have had nothing. Ronan felt his anger waver, replaced by something more complicated. So you took the song to protect her? The headmaster found out, Aoife continued, her words tumbling out now as though she'd been holding them back for decades. He told me that if I didn't do something, he'd make sure Eileen never worked in Cork again. He said the song was beautiful, that it could be a gift to the community, but not if it came from someone like her. She looked up at him, tears streaming down her face. I told him I'd written it. I signed the papers. I thought I was saving her, Ronan. I thought I was doing the right thing. And what did Eileen think? He asked, his voice hollow. Aoife's expression crumpled. She never forgave me. The kitchen was silent except for the ticking of the old clock on the wall. Ronan felt as though the ground beneath him had shifted, as though everything he thought he understood about right and wrong had become impossibly tangled. He turned and walked towards the door, unable to look at his mother any longer. Ronan, please. But he was already gone, stepping out into the cold evening air, his chest tight with a grief he couldn't name. The following morning, his mobile rang. It was the hospital. The nurse's voice was brisk, but not unkind. Mr. Kelleher, Eileen O'Driscoll is asking for you. She says it's urgent. I'll be there in 10 minutes. When he arrived, Eileen was sitting up in bed, her eyes clearer than they'd been before. In her hands, she held another cassette tape, different from the first. The label, almost completely faded, read, Confession 1982. She looked at him, and her voice was quiet but firm. I found another tape. The hospital room was silent when Ronan entered. Eileen sat upright, holding a cassette tape different from the first. The label, almost faded, read simply, Confession, 1982. She gestured for him to come closer. "This tape should never have existed," she said. "But it was the only way I found to keep what remained of the truth." With trembling hands, she placed it into a small borrowed recorder. Ronan pulled a chair beside the bed, his heart racing. The machine clicked and whirred, the sound of aged mechanics struggling to life. For a moment there was only static, a hiss that seemed to fill the small room like fog. Then a voice emerged, young, broken, desperate. It wasn't Eileen's voice. It was his mother's. "I can't bear it anymore, Eileen." The voice cracked, thick with tears. "They said they'd expel you, that they'd call you profane. I only signed the paper. I never wanted to take anything from you." Ronan's hands went to his head, his breath caught in his throat. This was a confession. A plea for forgiveness recorded over 40 years ago. He could hear his mother sobbing on the tape, could hear the rawness of her guilt, the way her voice broke on every word. "Please," the younger Aoife continued, her words barely coherent through the crying. "Please believe me, I thought I was protecting you. I thought if they knew about the baby, about him, they'd destroy you. The headmaster, he said terrible things, Eileen." "He said you were a disgrace, that the song was too beautiful to come from someone who'd sinned." There was a long pause, filled only with the sound of weeping. Then, distantly, a door slammed. The tape went silent. Eileen switched off the recorder, her face expressionless. The room felt smaller suddenly, as though the walls had moved closer. Ronan couldn't speak. He stared at the cassette player, at the small reels that had just unspooled decades of buried pain. "She stole my name to save me from shame," Eileen said quietly, her voice devoid of anger. "I forgave her, but the world never knew." Ronan looked up at her, his eyes stinging. "You forgave her? What else could I do?" Eileen's gaze drifted to the window, to the gray cork sky beyond. Hate her? Destroy her the way she thought the world would destroy me? What would that have changed? "It would have given you justice," Ronan said, his voice hoarse. "Justice," Eileen repeated as though tasting the word. "I used to think justice meant making her suffer, but suffering doesn't undo the past, Mr. Kelleher. It only creates more ghosts." She turned to look at him then, and Ronan saw something in her eyes he hadn't expected. Not bitterness, not triumph, but a kind of weary peace. "Your mother made a choice she thought was merciful. It wasn't. But it came from fear, not malice. And I've spent 40 years deciding whether that matters." Does it? Ronan asked. Eileen smiled faintly, a sad, distant expression. I don't know. But I'm too old to keep asking. The silence stretched between them, heavy with the weight of all the words that had been spoken, and all those that never would be. Ronan thought of his mother in her kitchen, her face pale with shame, the way she'd crumpled under the truth. He thought of the tape, of the young woman weeping into a recorder, convinced she was doing the right thing. Why are you showing me this? He asked finally. Because you need to understand, Eileen said, before you decide what to do next. What I do next. Ronan frowned. What does that mean? Eileen reached into the drawer beside her bed and pulled out a folded piece of paper. She handed it to him, her movements slow and deliberate. Open it. He did. It was a program for an event at the parish hall in Cork, scheduled for the following week. At the top, in bold letters, celebrating 40 years of Hymn for the Morning Sea, a tribute to Aoife Kelleher. Ronan's stomach twisted. You can't be serious. They're honoring her, Eileen said simply. The whole county will be there. The bishop, the Lord Mayor, everyone who's ever sung that song. And you want me to— I want you to listen, Eileen interrupted, her voice firm now. Because I'm going to perform it. Ronan stared at her, stunned. You're going to perform it? At her tribute? Not at her tribute, Eileen corrected. At mine. She leaned forward, her eyes sharp despite her frailty. I've arranged for a small recital at the parish hall the night before the tribute. The local choir has agreed to help me. It will be broadcast on the community radio. And I want you there. Why? Ronan's voice was barely a whisper. Because the song needs to be heard the way it was meant to be, Eileen said. Not as a hymn stolen and sanitized, but as a lament, as a memory of love and loss. And because— She paused, her expression softening. Because you deserve to know the truth before you decide what kind of man you want to be. Ronan felt something break inside him, a dam he hadn't realized he'd been holding back. He looked down at the program in his hands, at his mother's name printed in elegant script, and felt the full weight of what Eileen was offering him. Not revenge, but reckoning. Before he could respond, Eileen spoke again, her voice quiet but unyielding. The music needs to be played. There are things that silence cannot heal. She reached out and placed her hand over his, her skin paper-thin and cool. Go home, Ronan. Speak to your mother, and then decide. He nodded, unable to trust his voice, and stood slowly. As he reached the door, Eileen called after him. Mr. Kelleher? He turned. I'm going to play that song one more time, she said, her eyes distant as though already hearing the melody. But not for her. For you. In the days that followed, the city of Cork felt smaller. Ronan walked the cobblestone streets feeling like an intruder in his own history. At every corner he saw posters with his mother's photograph. Aoife Kelleher, honored by the County Council of Culture. The date of the ceremony was 1 week away. He knew that if the truth came out, her entire reputation would crumble. But he also knew that Eileen deserved justice. The weather had turned cold, a biting wind sweeping in from the harbor, carrying with it the smell of salt and rain. Ronan found himself walking without destination, past the English market with its vendors calling out prices, past the bells of St. Finbarr's Cathedral tolling the hour, past tourists taking photographs of the colorful shop fronts along Patrick Street. But everywhere he looked, he saw his mother's face. On the community notice board outside the library, in the window of the music shop where she used to buy sheet music, even in the expressions of strangers who hummed the hymn as they passed him in the street. How many people had sung that song at weddings, at christenings, at funerals? How many children had learned it in school, their small voices rising in unison? And how many of them knew that the woman they celebrated had built her legacy on a lie? That evening, Eileen rang him from the hospital. Her voice was stronger now, more determined. "The song needs to be played," she said without preamble. "There are things that silence cannot heal." "I know," Ronan replied, though he wasn't sure he did. "I've arranged a small recital at the parish hall," Eileen continued, "with help from an old choir in the community. It will be broadcast on the local radio, the same program that used to play your mother's version." Ronan closed his eyes, his hand tight around the phone. "When?" "The evening before her tribute. I want people to hear the song the way it was meant to be heard." "And you think that will change anything?" There was a pause. Then quietly, "I think it will change everything." The following day, Ronan went to see his mother. He found her sitting on the veranda of her cottage, wrapped in a gray shawl, her gaze fixed on the sea in the distance. She looked older than he remembered, more fragile, as though the weight of the past had finally settled on her shoulders. He sat beside her without speaking. For a long time, neither of them said anything. The wind moved through the garden, rustling the leaves of the ash tree, carrying the distant cries of gulls. Finally, Awif spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. I heard the fita. Ronan turned to her, startled. How? Eileen sent it to me, she said, still staring at the horizon. A nurse delivered it yesterday, along with a note. What did it say? Awif reached into the pocket of her shawl and pulled out a small piece of paper, folded and creased. She handed it to him. The handwriting was shaky but clear. You've carried this long enough. It's time to let it rest. Ronan felt his throat tighten. What are you going to do? His mother's eyes glistened with unshed tears. I don't know. She's going to perform the song, Ronan said. The night before your tribute, she's going to tell everyone the truth. Awif nodded slowly, as though she'd already known. I thought she might. And you're just going to let her? What choice do I have? Awif's voice broke, and she turned to look at him, her face wet with tears. She's right, Ronan. I've carried this too long. I was pregnant with you when it all happened. I was terrified. The headmaster said they'd sack me, that they'd ruin both of us if I didn't take credit for the song. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, her shoulders shaking. I told myself I was protecting her, that if people knew about her pregnancy, about her partner dying at sea, they'd destroy her. But the truth is, I was protecting myself too. I was scared, and I made a choice that haunted me every day since. Ronan didn't know what to say. He wanted to be angry, to condemn her for what she'd done. But looking at her now, broken, ashamed, still trying to justify a decision made in fear 4 decades ago, he found he couldn't. Did you ever try to make it right? He asked quietly. I tried to give her money, Awif said. I tried to help her find work. But she refused everything. She said she didn't want my charity. She just wanted me to tell the truth. And you didn't. I didn't, Awif admitted, her voice hollow. Because I was a coward. The silence that followed was unbearable. Ronan stood, unable to sit beside her any longer. He walked to the edge of the veranda, his hands gripping the railing, his breath coming in short, sharp bursts. Eileen said something to me, he said finally, not turning around. She said the song needs to be heard. That silence doesn't heal anything. Awif didn't respond. I think she's right, Ronan continued. I think you know she's right. His mother was quiet for a long time. Then, in a voice so soft he almost didn't hear it, she said, I know. That night, Ronan's mobile rang. It was a message from the community radio station. Eileen had requested that he introduce her performance. As the son of the woman who took from me. He stared at the screen, his pulse pounding in his ears. This wasn't just about music anymore. It was about choice. about whether he would stand with his mother's lie or with Eileen's truth, and he had less than a week to decide. The parish hall in Cork was packed. The old stone columns reflected the echo of footsteps, and the smell of candles mixed with sea salt brought an almost sacred atmosphere. At the center of the stage, a partially reconstructed piano, the same one that had survived the fire. Ronan adjusted the microphone whilst Eileen, in a dark blue dress with her hair pulled back, walked slowly towards the instrument. People filled every pew, every corner of the hall. Some had come out of curiosity, having heard whispers of an old woman's mysterious recital. Others had come because they recognized Eileen's name from decades past, from school programs and church newsletters long forgotten. And some, Ronan suspected, had come simply because they sensed that something important was about to happen. The air was thick with anticipation. Conversations hushed to whispers as Eileen took her place at the piano. Her hands, marked by burns and age, rested gently on the keys. She didn't look at the audience. She looked only at the instrument before her, as though it were an old friend she was greeting after a long absence. Amongst the crowd, near the back, a figure slipped in quietly. Wife Kelleher, her face partially hidden by a white scarf, found a seat in the shadows. No one noticed her except Ronan. When their eyes met across the room, she looked away, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Ronan felt his heart hammering as he stepped up to the microphone. His hands were slick with sweat, his throat dry. He'd rehearsed what he was going to say a dozen times, but now, standing before the assembled crowd, the words felt impossible. "Good evening," he began, his voice echoing through the hall. "My name is Ronan Kelleher. Most of you know my mother, Aoife Kelleher, as the woman who composed Hymn for the Morning Sea, a song that's been sung in our schools, our churches, our homes for 40 years. The crowd murmured softly. Some nodded, smiling at the mention of the beloved hymn. But tonight, Ronan continued, his voice steady despite the storm inside him, you're going to hear the truth about that song. And it starts with the woman sitting at this piano. The murmurs grew louder. Confusion rippled through the audience. Ronan saw his mother lower her head, her shoulders trembling. Eileen O'Driscoll wrote Hymn for the Morning Sea in 1981, Ronan said, each word deliberate. She wrote it in memory of her partner, who died at sea before they could marry. She wrote it whilst carrying his child, a child she would lose 2 months later. Gasps echoed through the hall. Some people turned to their neighbors, whispering urgently. Others stared at Eileen, trying to reconcile this story with the quiet, forgotten woman before them. The song was taken from her, Ronan continued, his voice breaking slightly. Not stolen out of malice, but out of fear. Fear of what the world would do to an unmarried woman who'd lost everything. My mother signed her name to it, believing she was protecting Eileen, but in doing so, she took the only thing Eileen had left. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the candles seemed to burn quieter, their flames still in the heavy air. Ronan stepped back from the microphone, his eyes finding his mother's in the crowd. She was crying openly now, the scarf fallen to her shoulders, her face exposed to the judgment of everyone around her. But no one was looking at her. They were all looking at Eileen. The old woman's hands moved to the keys. She didn't speak. She simply began to play. The first notes were soft, hesitant, like the tentative steps of someone returning to a place they'd left long ago. But as the melody built, it grew stronger, more confident. The music filled the hall, rising to the vaulted ceiling, spilling out through the open doors into the streets beyond. It was the same song everyone knew, the same hymn they'd sung at countless masses and school assemblies. But hearing it like this, played by the woman who'd written it in memory of a love lost and a child never born, it sounded completely different. It wasn't a hymn of praise. It was a lament. People in the audience began to weep. Some covered their faces, overwhelmed by the raw emotion pouring from the piano. Others simply sat, transfixed, as though witnessing something sacred. Ronan watched his mother. She was sobbing silently, her body shaking, her hands pressed to her mouth. He wanted to go to her, to offer some comfort, but he couldn't move. He could only stand and listen as Eileen played the song she'd been denied for 4 decades. When the final note faded, the hall was silent. No one applauded. No one moved. It felt as though the music had stolen the breath from everyone present. Eileen stood slowly, her movements deliberate despite her frailty. She reached into the pocket of her dress and pulled out an envelope. Old, yellowed, official-looking. She placed it on top of the piano and turned to face the audience. "This," she said, her voice quiet but carrying across the hall, "is the original deed of authorship. It has my name on it, my signature, my late partner's name beside mine." She paused, letting the words settle. "But tonight I'm giving it to someone else." She turned to look at Ronan. "The rights to this song now belong to Mr. Ronan Kelleher. Let him decide what the world should hear." The crowd erupted. Some gasped. Others shouted questions. A few stood as though to protest. But Eileen simply walked off the stage, her head held high, leaving Ronan standing alone with the envelope in his hands and the weight of an impossible choice pressing down on him. The news spread within hours. Mystery at Cork recital. Elderly woman gives song rights to son of original composer. Some called it a scandal, others a miracle. Ronan refused interviews. He took the documents to the County Council of Culture and made only one request, that Eileen's name be recognized as co-author, and that all future proceeds be directed towards music scholarships for young people without resources. The council agreed immediately, perhaps out of genuine remorse, perhaps out of fear of public backlash. Within days, plaques were amended, programs reprinted, and the story of Hymn for the Morning Sea was rewritten to include both names, Eileen O'Driscoll and Oive Kelleher. But Ronan knew the truth was more complicated than any plaque could convey. It wasn't a story of collaboration. It was a story of theft and forgiveness, of fear and redemption, of two women whose lives had been tangled together by a single, terrible decision. That afternoon, he went to the hospital. Eileen was weaker now, her breathing shallow, her skin pale against the white pillows. But when she saw him, she smiled. A small, peaceful expression that seemed to lighten the heavy air of the room. He pulled a chair beside her bed and took her hand. It was cool and fragile, like holding something precious that might break at any moment. "I did what I had to," he said quietly. "Your name is on the song now, where it should have been all along." Eileen's eyes glistened, but she didn't cry. She simply nodded, her gaze drifting to the window where gray clouds moved slowly across the Cork sky. "Then the sea will keep playing," she whispered, her voice barely audible. They sat in silence for a while, the only sound the faint beeping of monitors and the distant murmur of nurses in the corridor. Ronan thought about everything that had led to this moment. The fire, the cassette tapes, the confrontation with his mother, the recital. It all felt impossibly heavy and impossibly light at the same time. "Do you have any regrets?" he asked. Eileen turned her head slightly to look at him. "Only one," she said. "That it took a fire to bring the truth out." "Would you have told anyone? If the fire hadn't happened?" She considered this for a long moment. "No," she said finally. "I'd made my peace with the silence. But peace and justice aren't the same thing, are they?" Ronan didn't know how to answer that. He squeezed her hand gently and she squeezed back, a gesture so small and so significant it made his chest ache. "Thank you," she said, "for listening, for believing me, for doing what your mother couldn't." "She wanted to," Ronan said, surprising himself. "She was just too afraid." "Fear makes cowards of us all," Eileen replied. "But it also makes heroes of those who face it." Her eyes closed then, and her breathing slowed. Ronan sat with her until a nurse came to check on her, until the sky outside darkened and the hospital settled into its evening quiet. When he finally left, he knew he wouldn't see her again. Eileen O'Driscoll passed away 3 days later in her sleep, with the radio playing softly in the background. The station was broadcasting the recording from the recital, and the last thing she heard was her own music, finally given back to her. The funeral was small but well attended. People from the community came, former students, choir members, neighbors who'd known her in passing. Aoife Kelleher sat at the back, her face hidden behind dark glasses, her hands clutching a handkerchief. She didn't speak to anyone. She simply sat and listened as the priest spoke about forgiveness and redemption, about lives lived quietly and truths revealed too late. After the service, Ronan found his mother standing alone by the harbor, watching the gray water lap against the stone wall. The wind pulled at her white scarf and she looked smaller somehow, diminished by the weight of everything that had happened. He stood beside her, and for a long time, neither of them spoke. "She freed me more than she condemned me," Aoife said finally, her voice raw. "I've spent 40 years carrying that guilt, and in one night she let it go." "She forgave you," Ronan said. "I don't know if I can forgive myself." Ronan turned to look at her. His mother, flawed, fearful, human. She'd made a terrible choice born out of panic and self-preservation, but she'd also lived with the consequences, had carried the shame in silence, had tried in her own inadequate way to make amends. "Maybe that's not the point," he said. "Maybe the point is just to keep trying." Aoife smiled faintly, tears slipping down her cheeks. "When did you become so wise?" "I'm not wise," Ronan replied. "I'm just tired of being angry." They stood together as the sun broke briefly through the clouds, casting pale gold across the harbor. In the distance, the sound of church bells rang out, and somewhere someone was humming, "Hymn for the Morning Sea." But now, when Ronan heard it, he didn't think of his mother's voice in the church. He thought of Eileen's hands on the piano, of a melody written in grief and played in peace. He thought of a song that had survived fire and theft and 40 years of silence. and he thought of the lesson it had finally taught him, that not all justice requires revenge. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is simply let the truth be heard. There are people who spend their entire lives trying to forget what was taken from them, but there are those rare few who choose to remember, not to seek revenge, but to set themselves free. Eileen didn't win with shouts. She won with notes. Her greatest strength wasn't to fight back, it was to transform pain into music and hatred into peace. When the fire consumed her house, it didn't take who she was. It only revealed how much she could still be. And you? What would you do if you discovered that the person who destroyed your dreams also carried the weight of guilt? Would you be capable of forgiving, as Eileen did, and moving forward? Or would you let the past command the rest of your life? Sometimes forgiveness isn't a gesture of weakness. It's proof that the soul survived the fire. Not all justice needs revenge. Sometimes forgiveness is the only sound the world still needs to hear.